So I did a fast. I must say, I wasn't prepared. I did no research. Everything that you could do wrong, I did it wrong. But it's like, well, this is the date in the calendar, so I guess that's happening now. And it was horrendous. It was horrible. 5 days of terror and horror. It was just, I was hungry every day. I had these weird moments of like the worst hangover I've ever had. Headaches, nausea. It was terrible. However, the 5th day started to feel great, right? And at the end of the last practice, stupendous vision. So what I found from doing the fasting, it's the first time I've ever done a prolonged fast, there's a reason why this is a go-to for spiritual types. And yes, and so it culminated on the 6th day, the practice that I did. I knew something was going to happen because when I lit the lamp and then I lay down to do the practice, I could see a vision of fire where the lamp was, with my eyes closed. That shouldn't be there. So something's going to happen. Anyway, I finished the practice and then there was a vision that unfolded. I say stupendous because there were moments of overwhelming white light, such that I even forgot a part of it until the next day, and I was prompted by a horse. I was prompted by a horse. So it was alchemical in nature, and as it unfolded, I could see how magia is the alchemical tradition, and how all the alchemical symbols line up with magia, such that it would be possible for you to do the same. Knowing what you do from the practices, you should be able to look at the alchemical tradition itself and understand what it is, how it all fits together. But it was also something else. It took me a while to see this as I was reflecting on the imagery and so on. It was also a vision of the turning of the ages, appropriately enough. So it started like this. There was a view of the Earth from orbit. I'm afraid to say there was a bit of a curvature to it. The sun appeared coming out of it. Now, this also marks something as well, which is the initiate or the divine child leaving the underworld. But I won't go into that now. So there's the Earth. It's from orbit. The sun comes up. And so the idea is that the sun goes around the Earth. Right, that's the implication of that image. And then the sun starts to turn into like a giant reptile, like a dinosaur, something like that. The biggest dinosaur that ever lived, I think it was. I could actually find its name, but I can't remember off the top of my head. It's the dragon, it's the giant reptile. That circle around the Earth, that's the Ouroboros, the dragon or the reptile eating its own tail. It turns into that. Next scene, the dragon that's eating its own tail. There's now a serpent, and there's a place where there are these temples that look like, they're pyramids, but they look more like Mayan temples or Aztec temples, more so than, say, Egyptian pyramids. But they're pyramids. And the Earth is kind of a reddish color, so I'm thinking Mars. What this is not is a vision of an ancient civilization on Mars. And there were explosions in the air, right? Industrial warfare is the phrase that I used to capture it. It's like there was explosions and stuff like this. I'm saying Mars as in a martial quality to it, like conflict, war, that kind of a thing. And the snake went up one of the pyramids, the nearest one. At the top of the pyramid was Christ on a cross. The cross was ornate, it was gold. It had the 4 squares at each end of the cross, which represents the 4 evangels or the elements, At this point, I should say, there's extreme light coming from the cross. Now, the snake goes up the pyramid, and then it goes around the cross and around Christ like this, right? Then I'm shown what this means. What this means is that at the top of the pyramid is a tree. So you see the pyramid again, but there's a tree. The snake is going back up the tree. Now, in Orthodox iconography, sometimes Christ is depicted as having a zigzag shape, because there's this recognition that it's the snake that came down the tree with the fall, going back up the tree. Are there degrees of white light? But this would be the whitest of white lights. Something was accomplished. There was an accomplishment that happened. I'll pause here and just say something. A pyramid is a model of the Earth. That's what a pyramid is. So You probably all know this, being esoteric nerds, but the Great Pyramid of Giza is the dimensions of the Earth put into a 3D model shape. So of course the pyramid is also a mountain, right? But it represents the Earth. The first scene that I saw was the Earth, and then I saw the sun, which is the God, which is what you are, the God in eternity, standing in the fire of eternity, casting its shadow. It travels, and that's the same thing as the Ouroboros, which is the reptile or the dragon eating its own tail. Now, a word on the Ouroboros, what that is. One way of understanding that symbol is that it's the reconciliation of opposites. Jung would say that the head represents Christ and the tail represents the Antichrist. But needless to say, it's the union of opposites. It's eating its own tail, so it represents a movement through time, an eternal going, where there is the accommodation or the union of opposites in that going. That's why it's the serpent. Now, in the practices, what do we do? I don't know how obvious this is to people. The chapters of the book, they start at the bottom and they go all the way around the mountain and come back down again. The last chapter is the serpent, isn't it? What do you think the serpent is in the first chapter? Because it ends where it begins. So does anyone know what the serpent is? The silent knowing. Yes, the silent knowing. Silent knowing, which is the same thing as the seeing that I talk about, right? When you do a practice, there are 4 stages of a tree, aren't there? The silent knowing travels up the tree. That's what it does. It's going through your delusion and your awakenings. That's the serpent. Does this make sense to everyone? When you first decide to follow the silent knowing, that's the serpent seducing you. Yeah, to follow it. You grasp after that fruit which promises to make you a god. You grasp after it. And that's the beginning of the fall, isn't it? That drama of trying to make up for something that isn't absent. We have to travel through that before we get to realize that the fruit was ours all along. That's what the fall and then the Christ story, that's what that's supposed to represent. So the snake comes down the tree, goes back up the tree. So in alchemy, the snake goes into the tree and it's how it vivifies the tree so it can produce fruit. And then there are birds in the tree. Now, the image of Christ on the cross, we have another version of that, it's Perret. We talked about Perret last time, didn't we? We reflected on her story and how she embodied the teaching in her text. Her will was the same as God's will. And so she walked willingly to be burnt at the stake. Not in defiance, not as a protest, completely absorbed as she was in love of the divine. That's what she did. Christ did a similar thing. You could say that that's also a union of opposites. So the idea of Christ dying on the cross is that it's death that dies on that cross. Death was defeated. You might hear Christians say this, but it's death that dies on that cross. And it's like the darkness ran away with itself and said too much, and now has been exposed. Can't be believed anymore. So there's such a thing as eternal life. So something was accomplished on the cross. Yes, and like the caterpillar, exactly. So you can see there's all this symbolism that we already have. There's the snake going up the tree. It's what we do when we do our practices. We could even say what Christ accomplished is what we accomplish every time we do the practices. That's what's being done. It's also straight up alchemy. We talk about the philosophical tree, the nature of the snake going up the tree, and right. So we have one version, which is there's the earth and there's the sun. The mountain, the earth, the sun. We could say there's the pyramid and there's Christ on the pyramid right at the top, right where the opposites meet. But now we have a different symbol, right? Because the sun turned into the Ouroboros, or the dragon eating its own tail, which is an image of the union of opposites in the same way Christ is. But next in the vision, after the tree, and it was saying this is what was accomplished, was the Magia symbol. So you've got the pyramid, or the triangle, and the Ouroboros is what the circle is that goes around the top. So you can see it as the sun, but you can also see it as this Ouroboros, which is again a symbol for an eternal going through the accommodation of opposites, or through the union of opposites, which is alchemy, isn't it? But it's what creation is. So it had gone from this age where there's Christ, he's at the top, it's Christian era, we might call it that. There's industrial warfare, there's warfare going on. a period of war. And now it's switched. There's the pyramid, there's the earth, but the symbol now is not Christ on the cross, but the Ouroboros, the serpent eating its own tail. A different conception of God, or a development in the conception of God, which is an eternal going through the union of opposites. So it doesn't say all of that was wrong that came before. It says this is a development. It's changed. We're now in a different time. What was accomplished on the cross was accomplished, and now it's time for something else. Right, at this point, there was a horse on top of the pyramid. Briefly saw a horse, and then the circle, the Ouroboros, was now the vessel that the water bearer was holding, which is Aquarius, and was pouring out onto the pyramid, the earth, a herd of wild horses, all just pouring out and covering the pyramid, running down it. So the serpent went up, but now we've got these horses coming down. I'll come back to the horses in a second. That passed. There's lots of white light and stuff, right? So I actually forgot the horse bit until I remembered the next day, which I'll get to. But then there was two birds. There were two birds. When the snake goes up the tree, there are two birds in the tree. One of the birds was a phoenix. What is a phoenix? A phoenix sacrifices himself in his own fire to be reborn. So that's the god that goes, isn't it? Or the initiate. Right. So it's a bit on the nose when we do the fire practice. So sacrificing yourself to yourself, that's what the phoenix represents. Opposite the phoenix is the eagle, an eagle with an egg. The eagle with the egg, that's the goddess with the divine child. So that's the god and the goddess. They're the fruits on the tree where the serpent has returned to vivify the tree. And then the phrase, here endeth the vision. Because my problem is, this is my problem. Someone wiser than me pointed this out to me a long time ago. I can aim for something and have success in it, but then I overextend. I don't know when to stop, let's put it that way. So it's like, yeah, stop. The vision ends now. Like, stop trying to have more vision. Okay, so what does that all mean? Now, initially, I just saw it as an alchemical vision. And Jung has a book called Alchemical Studies. I recommend reading that book if you're interested. It should make sense to you, but wherever you see a quaternity, you know, there's four things. We have four things, don't we? We have the serpent, we have the tree, and so on. Anyway, the next day, I was reflecting on this alchemical stuff, going, oh, look, I can see how it fits here and how this all makes sense. I can see how the Ouroboros is a symbol. You could say it's a symbol for Christ, but obviously it makes more sense now that it's about going. It's about this eternal going as a God that unites the opposites in itself. Those are the two worlds coming together, the earth and the heavens, you know. Aleister Crowley wrote a book called Confessions. Confessions of Aleister Crowley. It's autohagiography, as he called it, modestly. He wrote this at a particular time in his life when you might say he'd reached the pinnacle of a certain grade in his magical order, right? And he describes this stupendous initiation, right? And he just hints at it and doesn't really describe it. But you can work it out from the text. His riddles aren't that hard to work out, you know. At the same time that this happened, he had memories of a past life. He drew an image of a teacher that he had in a past life, who was a Taoist teacher. And this became the portrait known as Lam, right from Lama, but it means to go. And he put it as the frontispiece on his commentary on The Voice of the Silence, written by Helena Blavatsky. Kenneth Grant and other pseudo-initiates took this picture and made up a story that Aleister Crowley did this working, the Amalantra working, during this period of time when he was on Esopus Island, and that it tore a hole in the fabric of reality that let the Greys in, and now there are aliens. And that this picture was a picture of an alien. Anyway, it's a picture of a Taoist master of whom he was a student. How do I know this? I saw the teacher. There's a guy called Michael Staley, who's like the successor to Kenneth Grant. I went to one of his workings, lamp workings, and I took part in a ritual, and I had the image from which the picture was drawn is what I recalled. And I told him at the time. And then he wasn't too happy. I wrote an article and it was in the Fortean Times, and he wasn't too pleased because I won't go into that. Anyway, The point is this: the highest expression of Crowley's wisdom, or what he considered the highest expression of wisdom, was the Chinese wisdom, was Taoism, right? And now that's been completely hijacked and ignored as a result of this silly alien stuff. But that idea of the changing of the aeons from the time of Christ to this Aquarian age, from Pisces to Aquarius, Crowley recognized this was the change that he talked about, this Book of the Law. And his understanding of that is that now it's the continuity of consciousness, or the going, that's the important part. So that symbolism of moving from Christ to the Ouroboros that eats its own tail is a symbolic representation of that. So the horses. I don't know how familiar people are with this particular aspect of Taoism. It's probably the least studied or the least accessible or widely known when it comes to Western scholarship. But after the initial pure Taoist stuff that you get with Lao Tzu and so on, there's an alchemy that develops, and they have explicitly an external alchemy where you mix potions and whatever, and an internal alchemy. Exactly as Jung describes for alchemy, where he says it's the spiritual process. They explicitly say this. It's not guesswork. They explicitly say it. Part of that alchemical tradition, which can easily be understood in exactly the same way with the symbolism from the Western alchemy and from Magia, because they're exactly the same thing. They had this variation of the 10 ox herding pictures, what they must have come across from Chan, which is Chinese Zen Buddhism, taming the wild horse. Why am I mentioning this? Now, there are many different things you can say about horses, spiritually speaking. So there's the sacrificial horse. Adida talked about himself as a sacrificial horse. There is the idea of the wild horse. There was a lot of Taoist literature around how ignorant it was to tame wild horses. What they were saying was this: the nature of a wild horse, that nature, is what it is that we aspire to with realization. You remember last time I mentioned a bloodless, as a child you can play in these fields in a wild place. You can play in a wild place, and then it gets bulldozed and people build houses on it. What is it that's lost there? What's the thing that's lost? And too often it can be expressed in a sentimental, nostalgic, icky way, right? It is itself a kind of a bloodless murder. It's not really the thing itself. A wild place is somewhere that doesn't belong to anyone or anything, but everything is welcome. That demonstrates it's like a reflection of something we talk about all the time, isn't it? A nature, something that has a nature, a generative nature that doesn't belong to anyone, can't be possessed. You literally can't possess a wild place. As soon as you possess it, it's not wild anymore. You can't possess a wild place, but it accepts, it doesn't turn anyone or anything away. So there's something there. To be in a wild place means to be somewhere in a different state, And that's often what is ignored or murdered or killed. That makes sense to everyone? This is the virtue of a wild place. This is why so many traditions say, go out into the wild. You go off on your own, go out into the desert. It says if you disrespect a wild place, it will kill you too. You better be able to see. Yeah, you can't take your delusions with you, can you? Otherwise you won't survive in there. Right, so there's an idea of the horse like that. The wild horse, it's already wild. If you tame it, you destroy it. There's something that's been destroyed. So you want to be like the wild horse. So that's one example. But there's another example. The taming of the horse that I talked about, these images, starts off with a horse that's already been bred, but it's escaped. And you need to go and get it. You need to go and catch it and bring it back. So that's the horse that's being tamed. Now, in that respect, the symbol of the horse is the chaotic, misdirected, overwhelming, habitual thought, something like that. So there's the wild horse, but then there's the horse that was already domesticated, that's escaped. This is what these images are about. So they're ways of describing stages that you go through with the practice of becoming still. How to become a celestial master. Join the ranks of the celestial masters. Now, in the vision, pouring it out from the water vessel of Aquarius, it's not going up the pyramid, it's coming down it. That's implying coming from heaven, isn't it, into the earth, something being received by the earth. and it's a herd, right, everywhere. It completely engulfs the pyramid. So we have a herd of unruly, chaotic, overwhelming, uncontrolled, habitual thought. That's what it looks like. Now, inherent in the symbol itself is another possibility, which I've just talked about, what horse could be, what it could mean. But that's showing you what the nature of the conflict, if we can put it that way. Instead of industrial warfare, which was in the previous age, like before it switched, now it's this overwhelming, uncontrolled, habitual thought, right? So herd mentality, a herd, the mass, the people. Anyway, that's all that was in that part of the vision for Aquarius. You know, the thing about visions is that you're supposed to pass them on. You're supposed to pass them on without altering them or changing them or anything like that. Sometimes people's commentaries do change the meaning, you know, or muddy the waters, you might say. But it's explicitly saying we're not in that place anymore. We're in a different time now. It's a different situation.